Shalom Aleichem, welcome. I'm Lisa Newman, the Yiddish Book Center's Director of Publishing and Public Programs, and I'm delighted to introduce this evening's program, Warsaw Testament with Samuel Kassow. I'd like to take a moment to thank Lawrence and Muriel Gillick and Rosa Rosenberg, whose generous support made possible the publication of Warsaw Testament. Before we get started, please note that your audio will be muted and your video off throughout the program. Excuse me, you may send questions via the question panel at the lower right of your screen. Please keep questions short and refrain from comments so that we can try to get to all of the questions this evening. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's presenter, Samuel Kassow, Charles H. Northam Professor of History Emeritus at Trinity College. He holds a PhD from Princeton University and is a fellow of the American Academy of Jewish Research. From 2006 until 2013, he was the lead historian for two galleries of the POLIN Museum of History of Polish Jews in Warsaw, which opened in 2014. Samuel Kassow is the author of Who Will Write Our History?, Emanuel Ringelblum, and the Secret Ghetto Archive, which received the Orbis Prize of the AAASS, was a finalist for a National Jewish Book Award, and has been translated into 8 languages. He is the translator of Rokhl Auerbach's memoir, Warsaw Testament, winner of the 2024 National Jewish Book Award for Holocaust Memoir. A child of Holocaust survivors, Samuel Kassow was born in a displaced camp in Germany. Welcome, Sam. And let me take just a minute to offer a real heartfelt congratulations from all of us at the Yiddish Book Center, White Goat Press, etc., for yesterday's announcement, so deserved, of the National Jewish Book Award for your translation of Warsaw Testament. And with that, I hand over the program to you.
Thanks. And I want to thank you, Lisa Newman, the White Goat Press. I want to thank Aaron Lansky, who's done so much to make the Yiddish Book Center a major cultural institution. And I want to thank my editor, Ezra Glinter, who really contributed a lot to the success of this book. Until relatively recently, few people had heard of Rachel Auerbach. She was a remarkable woman who survived the Holocaust, and then she dedicated her whole life to preserving the memory of the victims. Her life spanned many markers of the 20th century Jewish experience. Rural Galicia, Lviv, the Yiddish literary scene of pre-war Warsaw, the Ringelblum archive in the Warsaw Ghetto. In March 1943, just before the ghetto uprising, she left for the Aryan side of German-occupied Warsaw, procured a fake Polish ID, posed as a Polish woman, and crisscrossed the city as an intrepid courier for the Jewish underground. After the war in post-war Poland, she joined the Central Jewish Historical Commission, did pioneering historical research. After she left Poland for Israel in 1950, she started the survivor testimony division at Yad Vashem, and she played an important behind-the-scenes role during the Eichmann trial, where she urged Gideon Hausner, the chief prosecutor, to put survivor testimony front and center. Rather than just focus on Eichmann's particular activities in the Nazi bureaucracy, Auerbach believed that the trial had to educate Israelis and others about what it really meant to be a Jew under Nazi occupation. In the last years of her life, she reworked her wartime writings into memoirs of the Warsaw Ghetto. She finished one volume entitled Warsaw Testimonies, Fałszywe Tzawos, but she died in 1976 as she was writing the second volume. And it's those 2 volumes that I translated for the White Goat Press, and which has been issued as Warsaw Testament. Among Auerbach's wartime writing was a remarkable essay entitled Yisker, Remember. She wrote that essay in November 1943. The ghetto was now just a heap of rubble. The 500,000 Jews were gone. And on that dreary November day, she was riding in a streetcar in Aryan Warsaw, pretending to be a Pole. And by this time, of course, the Germans were engaging in daily public executions of Polish resistance fighters and Polish hostages. And so suddenly, a Polish woman sitting in the same streetcar as Auerbach began to weep. The Germans had just shot her son, she cried, my son, over and over. And Auerbach thought to herself, and I quote, I may neither groan nor weep. I may not draw attention to myself in the street. And I need to groan, I need to weep, not 4 times a year when people say the Yisker prayer. I feel the need to say Yisker 4 times a day. And that very night, she went back to her room on Smolna Street. Her landlady had no idea that she was harboring a Jew, and she began to write that essay, which she entitled Yisker. How do you say Yisker? How do you say the Yisker prayer for 500,000 Jews? And as she groped for images to explain the sheer magnitude of the catastrophe, she used the example of a flood in the mountains. And I quote, I saw a flood once in the mountains. Wooden huts, torn from their foundations, were carried above the raging waters. One could see lighted lamps in them, men, women, children in cradles tied to ceiling beams. Other huts were empty inside, but one could see a tangle of arms waving from the roof like branches blowing in the wind, waving desperately toward heaven, towards the riverbanks for help. At a distance, one could see mouths gaping, but one could not hear the cries because the roar of the waters drowned out everything. And that's how the Jewish masses flowed to their destruction at the time of the deportations, sinking as helplessly into the deluge of destruction. Now, why does she begin with the image of a natural disaster, a flood? I think that as she was writing, she could guess, she could intuit what people who were not there, the questions they would be asking after the war. Questions like, what had happened to those millions of Polish Jews? Why had they let themselves be fooled? Those tough, bright, resourceful Jews, why didn't they resist? By using the imagery of a flood, of a natural disaster, as my friend David Roskies once pointed out, Auerbach anticipated those very questions. But how do you criticize, how do you judge the reactions of people who were swept away in a tsunami? No, the Holocaust was not a meta-historical event. It had to be studied in detail. It happened, but its enormity was too horrible and too unprecedented to allow for glib theories and facile questions that might compromise the memory of the Jewish masses, a memory that she cherished so deeply. Now, in that very same essay, she added, and this is the key to understanding what she did with the rest of her life. She added, and I quote, and if for even one of the days of my life, I should forget how I saw you then, my people, desperate and confused, delivered over to extinction. May all knowledge of me be forgotten and my name be cursed like that of those traitors who were unworthy to share your pain. Auerbach never broke that vow. And for the rest of her life, she lived only to make sure that people remembered. Nobody told the story of the Warsaw Ghetto with as much passion and insight. Few worked more diligently to persuade historians, lawyers, the wider public to listen, really listen to the testimony of survivors and remember not just the famous names, but also the ordinary people who went to their deaths. At a time when the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising emerged as the symbol of Jewish resistance and heroism during the Holocaust, it was Auerbach who pleaded with the wider public to remember the writers and the poets and the ordinary Jews along with the fighters, to respect the importance of cultural and spiritual resistance, to ponder not just the trauma of mass murder, but also the deep wound of cultural genocide, because the Germans committed a double murder: the physical destruction of the Jews, but also the erasure of their Yiddish speech and cultural legacy. What Annette Viaborka called the era of the witness came about in no small measure thanks to the unstinting efforts of people like Rachel Auerbach to highlight the importance of survivor testimony, the Eichmann trial being a key example. At a time when scholars like Rokhl Hilberg argued that documents were much better sources than survivor accounts, Auerbach countered, yes, documents were well and good, but for obvious reasons, it's the perpetrators who are more likely to leave documents than the victims. And she demanded that scholars and jurists take survivor testimony seriously, focusing not just on content, but also on nuances of body language, phrasing, and affect. And so what if those giving testimony got this date wrong and that name wrong? Their authority of witness far outweighed any mistakes in the details. As one of only 3 survivors of the Oyneg Shabes Archive that Emanuel Ringelblum organized in the Warsaw Ghetto, that secret archive, only 3 survived out of 60 people. Auerbach had the rare opportunity not just to retrieve her wartime writings that had been buried, but then to rewrite and publish them. On July 26, 1942, the 4th day of the mass deportations to Treblinka, Emanuel Ringelblum ordered all the members of the archive to hand over everything they'd written without delay. Forget whether you finished or haven't finished, there's no time to lose, hand over what you have. And all of these documents were buried in what would become the first cache of the archive that would be discovered in tin boxes in September 1946. Now, by this time, the Germans, with the help of the Jewish police, were deporting 7,000 Jews a day. The Jewish police were catching the Jews and handing them over to the Germans. The police were promised that if they did their job well, they'd save their skin and that of their family. As Auerbach handed over her ghetto writings to Ringelblum's assistant, Eliyahu Gutkovsky, she quickly attached a note that exposed her feelings: raw fear, violent anger, and despair. And I'm quoting, "I'm handing over this unfinished essay to the archive, the 5th day of the deportation. Perhaps such horrors have already occurred before in Jewish history, but such shame, never. Jews as tools of the killers. I want to stay alive. I'm ready to kiss the boots of the worst scoundrel just to be able to see the moment of revenge. Revenge, revenge, remember." Now, if you look at what she just wrote here, you see a very important difference between real-time writing that Jews wrote in the middle of the war and post-war survivor testimony. In wartime writing, there was a lot more anger against other Jews. There were many more calls for revenge. After the war, the 6 million became the martyrs, the Kedoshim, and these feelings of anger and calls for revenge were toned down somewhat. But that's a topic for another talk. Now, in that same note, Auerbach also wondered whether her writings would share the same fate as the scribblings of a coal miner. trapped in an accident with no survivor, whose body would never be found. Would anyone read them? Would anyone care? And besides, she said she could no longer write coherently. And if she survived, what good would she be to anybody? Now, fast forward 2 years. It's now early 1944. She's on the Aryan side with false papers. Now she no longer has any doubts. She had to write. That was a debt that she owed to the dead, but she had to be careful. And I quote, "The mass murder, the murder of millions of Jews by the Germans, it's a fact that speaks for itself. It's very dangerous to add to this subject interpretations or analyses. Anything that's said can quickly turn into hopeless hysteria or endless sobs. So we must be careful. We must only write facts. This is my intention, not to express but to transmit, to note only facts, not to interpret." But she quickly added that this was an impossible mandate, even for herself. After the war in Poland and in Israel, after she recovered her wartime manuscripts, her writing would take on yet another purpose, which was to ensure that the Jewish people remembered what happened, not just to keep faith with the dead, but also to use the lessons of the Holocaust to strengthen the Jewish people and to tighten the bonds between Israel and the diaspora. Auerbach left Poland for Israel in 1950, and while she had many difficulties in her new home, she never wavered in her conviction that after the Holocaust, Israel had become the vital center of the Jewish people. And let me add, for those who erroneously see some tension, some contradiction between love of Yiddish on the one hand and Zionism on the other, just let them think about Rachel Auerbach, about Avram Sutzkever, about Leib Rochman, and many, many others. Like all good reportage, Auerbach's memoirs conveyed what she saw and observed in evocative, powerful language. And these make her writings an indispensable source for the cultural and social history of the Warsaw Ghetto. But for Auerbach, the first step in the process was to describe just what the Jewish people had lost when the Germans destroyed Jewish Warsaw. Melech Ravitch, the Yiddish poet who'd been one of Auerbach's key mentors and closest friends, had once called Warsaw a sprawling mosaic of different Jewish tribes and subcultures, Hasidim, Polish-speaking professionals, Litvaks, and others, Bundes workers. Auerbach took the shattered bits and shards of that mosaic and reconstructed the mosaic of memory based on a poignant evocation of dozens of individual vignettes. And thus she spoke for those who had no one to remember them, especially the ordinary Jews she came to know in the ghetto as she ran the soup kitchen on Leshno 40. And she also spoke for the Jewish writers, for the artists and actors whose milieu she chaired in the 1930s and then in the ghetto. The more one knew about what and whom the Germans had murdered, the more one could grasp the enormity of the national disaster, of the national Churban, as they say in Yiddish. Much of Warsaw Testament includes her wartime and post-war descriptions of the Warsaw Jewish intelligentsia. Writers like Kalman Lis, a wonderful poet who worked with children with special needs. Actresses like Miriam Orleska, who had played Leah in the landmark Vilna Trupa production of the Dybbuk. Sculptors like Avram Ostjega, who designed Peretz's tomb in the Jewish cemetery. The painter Roman Kramstik, composers and choir directors like David Eisenstadt, singers like his 17-year-old daughter, Marisha, who Jews called the nightingale of the ghetto, and who was gunned down in cold blood boarding a death train to Treblinka. Auerbach described Shia Broide, who translated Plato's dialogues into Yiddish, Yankov Gerstein, who composed a cantata based on the Yiddish poetry of Mani Leib. She talked about the religious poet Yisroel Stern, who wrote his best poetry, Auerbach believed, just weeks before he died in Treblinka. She wrote about Rosa Simchovich, a saintly pedagogue who dedicated her life to helping the poor kids who went to the Yiddish secular schools. She talked about Leib Schur, a bibliophile and librarian who collected abandoned Yiddish books in the ghetto and who hanged himself in his library rather than board the train to the gas chambers. She wrote about Basha Berman, who started a children's library where kids could come in, borrow books, and listen to stories about faraway places that promised a better world after the war. There was the 11-year-old Yosima, a musical prodigy who played Mozart's 25th piano concerto in the ghetto, after which the musicians in the orchestra lifted her up as the audience applauded and applauded. If only this play had survived, that cantata, that poem, that musician, what Auerbach heard in the ghetto, she believed, represented a flowering of Jewish genius. And I quote her now, it was a bright flame that burned brightest just before the final destruction. As Auerbach traced the broad reach of Yiddish culture, which embraced music and the arts as well as literature, she underscored the depth of a German murder machine that destroyed a language and a culture along with the people. Now, as soon as the war ended, she was resolved to carry out Ringelblum's legacy, find those tin boxes and milk cans buried under the trackless rubble of what had been the Warsaw Ghetto. There was a Yiddish writer, Mendel Mann, who recalled that at the third anniversary celebration of the Ghetto Uprising in 1946, Auerbach ran to the microphone, and after many tiresome speeches full of political posturing, Auerbach, who, by the way, was the only woman on the podium, begins to talk. And I'm quoting what Mann remembered. She did not make any speeches. She did not explain the meaning of the uprising. She implored. With a stubbornness that deeply affected me, she demanded, she called. Remember, she cried out, there is a national treasure under the ruins. Even if there are 5 stories of ruins, we have to find the archive. I'm not making this up. I know what I'm talking about. This isn't just talk. This is coming from my heart. I will not rest. I will not let you rest. We must rescue the Ringelblum archive. Auerbach held up the model of the Ringelblum archive, the codenamed Oyneg Shabes, where she felt a shared sense of national mission had trumped political differences. Ringelblum had brought together religious and secular Jews, Bundists, Zionists and communists, the famous and the not so famous, men, women, all in a common mission to collect and bury documents. Now, his teacher, the historian Isaac Schipper, had said to a fellow inmate in Majdanek just before Schipper was killed, Schipper said, quote, what we know about murdered peoples is usually what their killers choose to say about them. What we know about murdered peoples is usually what their killers choose to say about them. The Germans thought they'd win the war, they would destroy the Jews totally, and then they would determine how Jews would be remembered, if at all. But in an amazing act of spiritual resistance, Ringelblum said no. Posterity will remember us on the basis of Jewish documents and not on the basis of German documents. Those time capsules that we bury will surface someday, even if we don't live to see it ourselves. And then the murdered Polish Jews will be remembered not as a faceless mass of victims, but as individuals with names, with identities, individuals who were part of a resilient Jewish community with its own hopes, dreams, and agency. But Ringelblum also called on the fellow members of the archive not to pull punches, to be objective, to write about the bad as well as the good, to write about the collaborators as well as the heroes. Auerbach hallowed the exploits of the ghetto fighters, but she did not want their story to overshadow and diminish the memory of the 99% of Jews who had no weapons, ordinary Jews who did what they could to maintain their dignity, help their families, and who, lacking money, contacts on the Aryan side, the fluent knowledge of the Polish language, and even the ability to imagine the worst, had no chance in hell to survive, and who were swept away in the torrent of death. Now, like much of the Oyneg Shabes staff, including Ringelblum, Auerbach was active in the pre-war YIVO, where scholars and ordinary Jews worked together to study everyday Jewish life as is, to study not just the rabbis and the philosophers and the famous, but to study ordinary Jews. And it was this tradition that Ringelblum and Auerbach took with them into the Warsaw Ghetto. Now, her university degree was in psychology, and she paid special attention to the phenomenology of the Holocaust, investigating the wide range of emotional responses of individuals, families, entire social groups as they were engulfed by the disaster. The story that she told was complicated. Resilience, vitality, self-sacrifice on the one hand, corruption and moral collapse on the other. She had brilliant insights about how rumors, jokes, street songs could be seen as a self-defense reflex, a poignant but powerful sign of instinctive resistance. Auerbach stressed the Germans' skillful use of psychological factors to effect the destruction of Warsaw Jewry and used the Jews' very strengths against them. The Germans played with the Jews and with their natural human instincts of self-preservation and hope. In her brilliant observation of the mass hysteria that gripped the Warsaw Ghetto in the summer of 1942, Auerbach described how the very qualities that had served Jews so well in the past, practicality, pragmatism, hard-headedness, seichel, using your noggin, the Jewish natural optimism, wir werden sie überleben, we will survive them. All of those qualities now, in fact, accelerated their journey into the abyss. Natural optimism, we Jews have suffered before, will get through this. Seichel, look, let's buy time. We'll give them bribes. We'll give them gifts. We'll work hard for the Wehrmacht. Why would they want to kill us if we're so useful? Auerbach delved into the riddle of how Jews let themselves be fooled, how they failed to grasp the Nazi plan. And I quote, and now she's talking about those tough Jewish workers who before the war would beat up any of the anti-Semites who tried to come into the Jewish neighborhoods. And I quote, and still other Jews, broad shoulders, deep voice, with powerful hands and hearts, artisans, workers, wagon drivers, porters, Jews who with a blow of their fists could floor any hooligan who dared enter their neighborhoods. Where were you when your wives and children, when your old fathers and mothers were taken away? What happened to make you run off like cattle stampeded by fire? Was there no one to give you some purpose in the confusion? You were swept away by the flood together with all the others. Now, Auerbach asks if other peoples, non-Jews, confronted with a similar assault would have acted better. She did not think so. Did Warsaw Jewry eventually recover from the shock and fight back? Yes, we know they did. Should one blame the Jewish masses for not having fought back earlier? Only those who'd not been there would do so. Was armed resistance the only way that Jews stood up to the Germans? Absolutely not. Auerbach, like her fellow collaborator in the Oyneg Shabes, the writer Peretz Opachinsky, was a superb observer of the Jewish everyday. She had a fine sense of the nuances of the behavior and speech of different classes of Polish Jews, whether they lived in small towns or in urban centers like Warsaw. Like Ringelblum, she was a native of Southeast Galicia. Before moving with her family to Lvov, she had spent her childhood in a remote village, not a shtetl, but a village in Podolia, today southwest Ukraine, where she acquired a love of Jewish folklore and of the Yiddish language. Like many other Galician Jews, Auerbach combined this deep Jewish identity with a first-class Polish education and cultural sensibility. At Lvov University in the early 1920s, Auerbach befriended the young poetess Dvora Fogel and the budding writer and painter Bruno Schulz. In 1929, she helped begin a literary journal, Zusteyer, that she hoped would bring the largely Polish-speaking Galician Jewish intelligentsia closer to Yiddish. She would go on to have many other interests, but one of the most salient was her devotion from a very young age to Yiddish secular culture. And it was an inclusive rather than an exclusive vision, one that transcended politics and ideology. Much of the power of Auerbach's writing stemmed from her ability to navigate cultural boundaries, because she lived a life that straddled different worlds: village, shtetl, and city, Yiddish and Polish, Poles, Jews, and Ukrainians, Galicia and Warsaw, the milieu of the Yiddish literary elite and the world of the Jewish masses, religious and secular, diaspora Zionist, nationalist, and Zionist. Auerbach really lived on the boundaries of all these different cultures. Now, when the war began, when Germany attacked Poland in September 1939, after Poland capitulated, Auerbach was about to flee to Lvov when she received an unexpected summons from Emanuel Ringelblum, who said, "You don't have any right to run away. People have to stay and help run our relief." And he asked her to stay behind and run a soup kitchen. And Ringelblum thus brought Auerbach into the far-flung network of an amazing institution in the Warsaw Ghetto called the Self-Help, with hundreds of house committees, dozens of soup kitchens, daycare centers for children. Auerbach's soup kitchen on Leshno 40, which fed 2,000 Jews a day, offered her a unique vantage point to get to know and observe a large number of ordinary Jews struggling to stay alive. The story she told is a gripping behind-the-scenes look at the desperate battle the ghetto was waging against hunger. She investigated the social history of hunger by telling a story of a soup kitchen as a microcosm of human relationships and human choices. The dead who ended up in the pits of the Jewish cemetery were not an undifferentiated mass, but individuals whose idiosyncrasies Auerbach recorded. She deftly caught the phrases and habits that made them memorable. The young mother expelled from her shtetl, who arrived at the soup kitchen with 4 children in tow and a tot suckling at her breast and pointing at this little baby. "Look at the little guy, look at the little guy. Odama mensch," she would say, smiling. A family of solid, rugged Jewish boys from a country farm who'd also been expelled into the ghetto. Each day they take a bowl of soup for their aged father. When they mentioned him, they never failed to add, "Im zu 120, may he live to 120. She describes solid members of the Jewish middle class, now reduced to desperate poverty. Auerbach, as the director of the soup kitchen, confronted serious psychological pressures and moral challenges. Like other figures in the self-help in the Alleinhilfe, she had seen herself. She'd seen herself as an honest public servant, imbued with the moral code of the progressive Jewish intelligentsia. But very quickly, she realized that for the masses of starving, desperate people who came to the kitchen each day, she was a privileged character. She represented authority and power. In their eyes, she had become an arbiter of life and death as they begged her to give them just one extra bowl of soup. Like Ringelblum, she'd come from a milieu that was imbued with love for the Jewish masses. Now these masses, these ordinary Jews, stormed her office, blocked her in the corridors, and begged her for extra soup tickets. They looked at her as someone who could save them. Some confronted her in silent supplication. Others yelled and loudly reminded her of their former status. And then there were the children who would come in little packs, cajole her in Yiddish accented Polish, and beg for extra food. And she realized that those 600 calories a day that they got in the soup kitchen would not save them from starvation if that's the only source of food they had. She asked herself, what am I doing? We're just prolonging the agony, but who are we really saving? What should we do? Should we pick out a chosen few and feed them, or should we dole out equal rations and save nobody? In a diary entry on August 4th, 1941, she noted, and I quote, "What is the use of all our work if we can't save even one person from death by hunger?" Ringelblum gave her new assignments. In September 1942, he asked her to interview Avram Kshepitsky, who just escaped from Treblinka. He'd been 11 days there. And the interview ran to more than 100 typed pages in Yiddish. By the way, that interview, all that information was sent by the Oyneg Shabes to the Polish government in exile in London, and then it was transmitted to the US and to the British. Kshepitsky did not survive, but after the war, Auerbach developed a special bond with the Treblinka survivors. As I said, just before the ghetto uprising, she escaped to the Aryan side, and she continued her documentary work. She continued her archival work. She, with the help of Polish good friends, including the Żabinskis, he was the director of the Warsaw Zoo, and his wife, you may have read The Zookeeper's Wife, Auerbach buried more writing in two different locations, on the grounds of the zoo and in a field in Mokotów. Both of those caches survived the war. As Auerbach wrote, I had better luck saving paper than saving people. I had better luck saving paper than saving people. Auerbach's years in Israel and at Yad Vashem are the subject of another talk, although I'd happily answer questions in the Q&A. But I'd like to end by saying how apt it is that we honor her memory, and that we do so at the National Yiddish Book Center, which has done so much to promote the Yiddish culture to which she dedicated her life. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to try to get to all of these with you quickly. Only some of the Ringelblum archive has been unearthed. Have they stopped looking? Any idea what has gone missing? As the archive continues to be studied, what new information has been learned?
Well, clearly, not all the archive was found. There was a first cache that was buried in August 1942, and that was discovered in September 1946. That was buried in tin boxes. There had been a lot of water seepage, so a lot of documents had been ruined. And Hirschwasser, one of the three survivors, who was the only person who knew where they buried the archive, said, look, we buried a lot more. Keep looking. They kept looking, but they couldn't find more. And then Auerbach, Wasser, and they left Poland. They went to Israel. And then in December 1950, Polish construction workers unearthed 2 aluminum milk cans. Now, they thought there would be diamonds and gold in those milk cans, site of the former ghetto, because, all Jews had gold and all kinds of stuff, as people believed. When they saw they were paper, they were going to throw them away, but then the foreman came back from his lunch break, and he said, no, you can't throw them away. We have to save this. Wasser said that just before the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, there was a third cache that was buried under the brushmaker's shop. The third cache was buried at a place that later became the site of the Chinese embassy in Poland. And in, I think, 2000, 2002, the Chinese allowed Israeli searchers to look, but they couldn't find anything. And I don't think the third cache exists. So much has been lost. Nevertheless, there are 35,000 usable documents. They've been published in book form in 36 different volumes. The Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw is publishing an English version in 10 volumes. And this is an amazing, irreplaceable source to understand the history of ordinary Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto. So even though much was lost, that which remains is an incredible resource.
How do you believe she survived?
Well, all survivors survived because of sheer luck. Every survivor has a story that basically it's just dumb luck. I mean, that's how my mother survived, my aunts survived, uncles survived. But Auerbach writes in her book, which I translated, she says, I didn't survive because I was smarter than anybody else. But if I had to look for a reason for my survival, I think one reason might be that as a kid, I spent so much time with Poles and Ukrainians, Polish and Ukrainian kids, and I absorbed their culture. I got to understand them. And therefore, she had an easier time pretending to be a Pole. Not only that, but she not just spoke the Polish literary language, but she also spoke the everyday language. And so she really was able to pass. And she believed that if there was one factor that facilitated her survival, that was probably it.
Did Rokhl Auerbach write of any elderly dissenters who were against armed resistance and counseled the people to seek another path, one which some would survive?
Look, the question of armed resistance is a very complicated one. Let me say right off the bat that armed resistance was very much the exception and not the rule. Yes, there was an armed uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto. In the Vilna and the Białystok ghettos, where the fighters were better armed, the Jews were against armed resistance. What made the Warsaw Ghetto uprising really possible, as Javi Dreyfus has pointed out in her last book, is that unlike other areas in Poland, the surviving Jews of Warsaw supported the idea of armed resistance. Now, they didn't do this right away. Much of Warsaw Testament is about Jews' delusions, Jews' false hopes, the ability of the Germans to trick the Jews. But a major theme is that after September 1942, after the Germans had already deported more than 300,000 Jews, the surviving 60,000 Jews in the ghetto said, no more. We're not going to let them trick us anymore. We're not going to believe them no matter what they say. And because the quote unquote civilians supported the fighters, the civilians built 750 bunkers. It was because of those 750 bunkers that the Germans had to clear out one by one by one, that the ghetto uprising lasted a month. Had it not been for those bunkers, it would have been over in 1 or 2 days. So there was a real symbiosis between the fighters and the non-fighters. But Auerbach, who's so good at social psychology, really describes the psychological turning point that happened in September and then happened even more in January 1943, after the first armed resistance against the Germans.
Can you speak a little bit about the volume 2 extracts or excerpts that run throughout the book?
Yeah. If somebody has a copy of the book, they'll see that many pages in the book are shaded differently. And those are the pages that are taken from volume 2 of her memoirs. Now, as I said in my talk, she finished volume 1 and it was published in 1974. That was entitled Warszawa Savoys, so Warsaw Testimonies. She was writing volume 2, but she never finished it. She passed away from cancer in 1976, and it was unedited. So much of it was just a jumble, and it really couldn't be published as is. What I did was I took the liberty of integrating pages from volume 2 into volume 1, pages that fit together well. And of course, I owe quite a lot to Ezra Glinter here. And so what we have here is the entire first volume and selections of the second volume that I think bolster the value of that first volume.
Yes, as a reader, I find them really interesting. It's trying to get through a couple more of these. Hang on. Are the other ghetto archives led by historians from YIVO? Question mark. Were they inspired by the 1917 plea for personal witness after World War II so that the victors do not write our history?
Well, I mean, there's that tradition. I mean, if we begin with Shimon Dubnov in the 1890s, who call on the Jews to write their history, to know their past, to know who they are. The Yiddish writer Yitzchak Leibush Peretz in 1915, just before he died, saying, if we don't write our history, our enemies will. Eliyahu Cherikover, collecting the documents about the terrible pogroms in Ukraine where 100,000 Jews died. This idea of a people that lacks a state and that lacks an army can turn pen and paper into a weapon. And this was certainly a tradition that encouraged the Oyneg Shabes and encouraged the documentation efforts in many other ghettos too.
Is it known that what the actual number of canisters were and possibly how they were located, but that's so hard to know?
Well, we know that the second cache was buried in 2 milk cans. And probably there were a lot more than 10 boxes in the first cache, but we have no way of knowing how many they would really be.
And I'm going to make this the last question. I'm mindful of time here. Are there significant differences between her original version in Polish and the revision in Yiddish?
There are a lot of differences. There are a lot of differences. I mean, one of the interesting differences, and she talks about this, is that whereas while she was running the soup kitchen, she was in despair. She thought, why am I doing this? Why are we doing this? What's the point? We're not saving anybody. After the war, she realized that the soup kitchens made a big difference, because if people had another source of food in addition to the soup kitchen, they had a chance to survive. And it's interesting when you think about it, the official German ration was 190 calories a day. That was the official ration that you could get on your ration cards. If you had a ticket to the soup kitchen, you could get 700 calories, but you're not going to survive longer than 3 or 4 months on that. But when the deportations to Treblinka began on July 22nd, 1942, of the 500,000 Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto, only, quote unquote, 100,000 had died of starvation or disease, meaning that 80% somehow had found a way to stay alive. How did they do that? Massive smuggling, massive resourcefulness. But Auerbach also understood that the self-help and the soup kitchens were an integral factor in this vast project of national resistance. Resistance meaning you do what you can to stay alive.
Thank you so much for the work of translating this, your introduction in the book, and for joining us this evening. So appreciated. The book, again, for everyone out there, is Warsaw Testament. It's available at shop.yiddishbookcenter.org and wherever books are sold. I urge you to go out and get a copy if you haven't already. I want to thank, in addition, Mia Pope, our producer this evening, who's been doing a great job of managing a huge audience here. And I want to make sure to thank all of you in the audience, our members whose support makes all of our ongoing work possible. Please visit yiddishbookcenter.org/donate, where you can renew your membership, give a membership, or become a sustaining giver, and continue to watch our public programs, podcasts, and more. To view our calendar of upcoming events, visit yiddishbookcenter.org/events. Until next time, stay strong, stay healthy, and stay in touch. And thanks for joining us.